Hi, class. We are to the lecture on survey research. This is a lecture I really like. It's very simple, very straightforward, and very useful. I think it's one of those lectures that will change the way you see the world. And I don't mean to be really dramatic on that. I just mean that you'll start looking at survey questions in a whole different way. Believe it or not, they are very hard to write. In fact, when I taught psychometrics, which is an entire class on designing good questions and learning the statistics all around making sure your questionnaire is a good one, I used to show a movie where I think it was the SAT is made by a company in New Jersey called Princeton, and the movie that I used to show interviewed some of the people who designed questions. And this one guy joked, he'd come home from work and his wife would say, "How was your day?" And he said, "It was a great day. I designed one survey question that's going to work." For some things, it's so difficult, and especially when you're thinking of questions that a lot of money is writing on, like entrance exams, etc. People really have to know their stuff, and they really have to make sure they're doing it right, and they have to prove that they're relevant to all different kinds of audiences. So we're definitely not going to go in depth this time, but we are going to talk about survey research and designing good questionnaires. So here is what we've got on deck. We have 4 main parts to this lecture, and we're going to take a break right in the middle. The first, I'm going to have to give you some definitions so you will understand other things, anonymity and confidentiality. Then we'll go into guidelines for writing items, take a break, talk a little bit about item formats, and then give you some hints for putting it all together. So anonymity versus confidentiality. Well, you might think these words are the same thing, but they're not. They're very different from each other. Anonymity means that participants' names cannot be associated with their answers. A benefit of this is that it's easier to get responses from participants, and it's difficult, if not impossible, to track their data. So if at all possible, it's just ethically the easiest for research to make sure that your participants are completely anonymous. There's absolute no link to their data, or to their between their identities and their data. However, sometimes this is not as easy as it sounds. While I was in graduate school, I worked part-time at the state of California Department of Health Services, Office of AIDS. So one of the data sets that I had contact with was data on all the people who got testing for HIV in the late 90s at any state-run clinic. So the issue was pretty touchy then, and people were not as open-minded about sexuality as they are today either. It was a different time, and we had to be really, really careful when we presented our data. We had a rule that when we were analyzing our data and reporting different frequencies of people who were tested or who were negative or positive for HIV who lived in a county, we could not report any statistic, any category in which there were under 5 people. And as an example, let me give you, let's say I was reporting data for a very small county in Northern California, and I could tell with my data how many female to male transgendered people tested positive for AIDS. Well, if there were only one female to male transgendered person in the county that people knew about, if I reported that one person reported positive, they would know it was that person. So even though we didn't get the person's name when we collected data, there was still enough in that data to identify a person. So even though it was anonymous, we had a further ethical duty to protect that individual's private information that they had given to us as researchers with a sacred trust to take care of it. We could not divulge that. Another great example, and this is kind of a classic example, I don't know if any of you HDFS majors have heard of the Berkeley Growth Study. Super famous study. It was done, I think, in the 1960s, and it was when a professor at Berkeley got a whole bunch of money from the government because modern science didn't know very much about normal physical and mental growth in middle childhood and adolescence. We knew about a lot about infants and toddlers, but we didn't know the normative trajectory of a lot of growth during middle childhood and adolescence. And so it was a famous study. It found a lot of things that have been further researched and are the basis of what we now know about childhood and adolescent development. So it was made the cover of Time magazine. So there's a big magazine, and those were before the internet, so magazines were all over, even bigger than they are now, and Time was one of the biggest. It went to almost every American household. And the cover of Time had an pre-adolescent girl, about 9 years old. She had not started to go through puberty yet. In the cover was from her belly button to her neck. She was not wearing any clothes, and she had her arms outstretched. Now, it obviously wasn't very sexy because she was a child. She hadn't gone through puberty yet. But what she did have on was a bracelet. She always wore a little gold bracelet. And so people who bought the magazine, who lived in her community in Northern California, recognized her. So at school, at church, in her town, people knew her by wearing that bracelet. And she was on the cover of a national magazine. Now, needless to say, her family sued Time magazine. They sued the researchers for releasing the picture, and her family got millions of dollars because the researcher violated and did great psychological harm to her. And could you imagine if you were 9, if people saw you naked? It would be horrible. Great psychological harm. They violated their ethical principle to keep the anonymity of the clients or the participants. So anonymity is absolutely critical in research surveys. Confidentiality, actually, let me back up. Anonymity is critical if you can swing it. However, sometimes you just can't keep anonymity. One reason that's very, very common is if you want to follow up with people. If someone answered one way and you want to really figure out what they answered because that's important to your question. Or if you're doing a longitudinal study and you want to follow up the same people over time, you need to identify those participants so you can link their records over time. And sometimes in the cases of interviews or recordings, you can, you know who a person is. Just by gathering data, you know who they are. So confidentiality is the researcher's responsibility when, just by the nature of the research, they know who the people are. Confidentiality guarantees that you will not disclose data in any individual form. It's your duty as a researcher not to disclose data in any individual form. Your first responsibility is to your test participants. So you're not going to tell people what they told you in confidentiality for the good of science. Now, one way that people remain confidentiality is that they assign people IDs. So, for example, I've got a data set on my computer that was gathered from 350 low-income mothers around in rural areas around the whole country, and I don't even have their names, any identifying information. I've got longitudinal data on these people, but all I know is their ID number. the team that collected that data, and I was actually part of that team. Everybody from each state sent their data to a central location where all the names were stripped from it. All the names were removed permanently once we got the informed consent forms processed, and everybody was just assigned numbers. So that way we can use the data set, but we don't know who they are. So we can maintain that confidentiality. It's not difficult. Another thing we did on the interviews, right as we assigned the numbers, we also had some qualitative data where we had interviews where they told us details about their life. You know, it was just about their health habits and their parenting styles and things like that. But even with that, as soon as we got the data in, as soon as they were transcribed, and transcribed means we took the interviews and we turned them into written scripts so we could analyze them, we separated. We destroyed the recording so we couldn't recognize tone of voice or accent or anything like that. And then we made pseudonyms, and pseudonyms are fake names. We made pseudonyms for the mothers, the children, and the towns they lived in. So there's no way anybody could find out who these people were. And this is critically important. When we first moved to Hawaii close to 20 years ago, there was something on the news that a researcher at Straub had been doing a women's breast health study, and the data were not de-individuated, which means that the data still had the names attached to all these people's answers to their questions about their breast health and female health and things like that. And the researcher left their laptop in the trunk of their car, and their car got stolen. So they had to warn anybody who'd participated in the study that strangers who stole a car had their personal information. It was sort of a brouhaha, if you can only imagine. So confidentiality is really important to maintain, and signing ID numbers and de-individualizing the data, I don't think I said that word right, is our techniques that we use to keep participants' data confidential. Now, there are some legal restrictions, and when I say legal, I mean the law. In most cases, and if you take an ethics class in graduate school, you'll talk about that a lot, but in some cases, your ethical duty, which is never to betray the confidence of your participants or clients, sometimes that ethical duty clashes with your legal responsibilities. Is you might be ordered by a court, or there might be situations when you have to divulge participants' identity. And one example of this is duty to warn. And the most famous case of duty to warn occurred at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, probably in the early 80s. And it's so famous, there's even a law named after it, Tarasoff. And basically there was this woman at the university, she was just a college student, and she was dating this guy who was a little sketchy. I mean, of course, she didn't know that when they were first dating. So they were dating, and then they broke up, and he was not mentally stable, and he was seeing a counselor at the college, and he told the counselor that he was going to kill her, his ex-girlfriend. He told the counselor that he was going to kill his ex-girlfriend, and that he had a plan to do it. I think he was going to strangle her, something really awful. And the counselor did not tell anybody, because the counselor was thinking ethically, and the counselor said, well, I don't want, him to get arrested or something when he hasn't done anything yet. So the counselor didn't say anything, and then the guy went and killed his girlfriend, or his ex-girlfriend at that point. And so that was a really big case, and it arose an ethical dilemma, because how do you know if somebody's going to do it or not do it? I'm sure we've all said things in anger when we're upset that we have no intention of doing. So out of that arose the duty to warn principle. And that really stands for anyone that works with people, researchers, counselors, social workers, even teachers. If a professional believes that a person, a client or participant, is going to harm self or other, they have to report it to the police or to the appropriate legal body. And usually what the professional does is they take all of the facts surrounding the situation and they make an assessment, and they of course document it thoroughly. In this case, at UCLA, the counselor should have definitely known. Not only did this guy say he was going to kill his girlfriend, but he said he had a plan. He said approximately when he was going to do it. He said how he was going to do it. And in that case, it's the counselor's responsibility. If the person says they have a strong intent of harming themselves or others, and they have a way to do it, it's a legal restriction. And you might think, well, when's that going to happen in a survey? Well, it actually has happened. One of my research advisors was doing a survey just like we're talking about, the questionnaire that people fill out, with some older adults, older war veterans, and who many of them had PTSD. And while she was giving the survey, this man walked up to her and he says, I see blood. There's blood all over the page. I feel awful. There's blood all over the cage and I want to shoot something. And so she luckily had a therapist on board, and she said, don't fill out the survey, and she got him to the therapist who helped and talked him down. So in that case, it's a duty to warn, and she was lucky enough to have a therapist online, so she didn't have to call the cops. But if he had been violent, she would have had to call the police, because it's her duty to warn if the person is showing harm to self or others over even a questionnaire. Another example, and this happens a lot for people who go into school psychology, for IQ tests or children's moods. Sometimes children or professionals who work with children will be required by the court to testify in their parents' divorce hearings. So it's not uncommon for the courts to request records from professionals who deal with children. And when I was getting my master's, I used to work for a school psychologist, or actually he was in private practice, but he did a lot of school-age kids. And what his technique was, because he really believed in the ethical duty to maintain the confidentiality of his child clients especially, and the things that his child clients told him in order to help him heal them, he didn't think that they were any business, and he definitely didn't think that it facilitated their healing if they were divulged to a parent in the middle of a divorce. So what he would do is he would refuse to respond until the courts really threatened him. And oftentimes the judges would back off. My mentor would write a letter and he would say, I can't tell you this, I think would be harmful for the child. And sometimes the court would back off. But if the court persists, it's ultimately the professional's legal duty. So confidentiality is, like I said before, it's a second choice to anonymity. If you can at all, gather your data and so that your participants are anonymous. That's really your best bet, because you don't have to deal with this. But if you cannot do that, and there are many good reasons why you might not, you have to maintain confidentiality. It's your ethical duty to take steps. So even accidentally, the data cannot be disclosed in any individual form. And even if you take those steps, you still have a legal duty to warn if you find information that means that person is harmful to self or others, or if you're requested to divulge records to the court. But then, of course, if you're faced with those legal restrictions, you as a professional need to balance very carefully the rights of the participants versus the law. So it's not always straightforward, but it's really interesting. So now you know about anonymity and confidentiality, and you know that there are important considerations before you even start designing a survey. So confidentiality you will not disclose data, you know it, but you won't tell anyone. Anonymity is you don't even know it. Okay, now some guidelines for writing test items. As I said before, it's not easy, but I'm going to give you some guidelines to help you. First thing you do is generate an item pool. And I even do this when I write tests. Anytime you write items, if you're designing a survey, the easiest thing you want a lot of options. You want lots and lots of questions. And so you can consider the absolute best ones, and you won't get too attached to any questions because you're going to need a lot because you're going to have to narrow them down. You want them to be good. The other thing you want to do right at the beginning is to define clearly what you want to measure. So let's say I want to do Yankura's love test. So I want to do a love test. Oh, I'm cracking myself up sitting in front of my computer. Anyway, all alone. Anyway, you want to do Yankura's love test. And you want to make sure first, what kind of love do you mean? Do you mean friendship? Do you mean godly love? Do you mean brotherly love? What kind of love do you mean? Well, you want to think about that, and you want to think that there are all different kinds of love. So before you write your test, if you want questions about romantic love, know that clearly before you write their questions, because there are specific characteristics of romantic love that won't hold for other types of love. And so you want to make sure that you're measuring what you want to measure, right? You want to make sure your measure has validity. And the other thing you also want to think about is that you don't want to fatigue your participants. They're doing you a favor by taking their time and answering your survey. And so you don't want to make them answer more questions than they have to. So if you don't define your construct and you have 100 different questions that are all different kinds of love, but all you really want to know about romantic love, just ask them 10 specific questions that get what you want to know. So you're going to need to define very clearly what you want to measure. Also, keep your wording simple. Sometimes, and I've taken tests like this, the question is, I'm exhausted by the time I read the question. Don't spend time making your questions fancy or pretty. Ask as simply and clearly as you can, because your focus really is on the people's answers. So instead of saying, please indicate the item for which you have a decided and definite preference. Whew, I'm exhausted. I need a nap just after reading that question. Whew. Just make it simple. Which item do you prefer? Much better question allows the person to put their energy to the answer instead of figuring out what you mean by your question. You also want to avoid vague questions. So, for example, if somebody asks me, how do I care for this garment? I might say, well, if it's a sweater, I don't hang it up. I keep it in a drawer. If it needs to be hung up, I always hang it up. If it's suede, I don't wear it in the rain unless it's waterproofed, etc., etc. They asked me how I cared for the garment. Or if I really take it, I could say, how do I care for this garment? I care for this garment so much. I love this coat. It's my favorite. Duh. No, you don't want to know all that stuff. You just want to know, if you want to know how someone washes their clothes, ask them, how do you wash it? Don't try to be fancy or special and use a more vague term. Use the specific term. If you want to know how you wash it, ask them how they wash it. Don't ask them how they care for it. Another thing you're going to want to do is avoid double-barreled items. And those are items, and you would be surprised at how much those items turn up. And in the modules for this week, I put the link to a blog, and I think it's called Bad Survey Questions, and it looks like it's out of the United Kingdom, and it's hilarious. It has people report bad questions they've seen on surveys, and I see bad questions all the times, and double-barreled items are the ones that I see the most, and they're so easy to avoid. And double-barreled items are essentially asking two questions with one question. So for an example, asking someone, do you approve of abortion in cases of incest or threats to the mother's health? Well, that's a totally confusing question, because what if I do believe in threats to the mother's health, but I don't believe in it for incest? Or what if I believe one or the other or both? How do I answer that? So ask one question at a time. Do you approve of abortion when the mother's health is threatened? Yes or no. Do you approve of abortion in this case, in that case? One question at a time. Don't ask two questions in one. And this other question, this bad one, is also, it's asking, do you disapprove of it? Well, you want to be really clear in your question if you want to keep that direction straight. And do you approve is much more easier to interpret than do you disapprove, because do you disapprove is kind of a double negative. So not only avoid double-barreled items, but avoid double negative items. Then you also want to avoid biased wording. How fast was the car going when it smashed into the trash can? That is a biased question, because smashed implies that it was going fast. A better question would be, how fast was the car going when it hit the trash can? When it made contact with the trash can? That way you're letting people decide for themselves if it were fast or slow. And there's a whole great, interesting literature on biased wording that comes out of studies like the one, do you remember I think it was the first day of class, or no, the first lecture, when I asked you and I made you remember a false word? Well, this question comes from that whole line of study where psychologists or scientists studied how lawyers manipulated jury's responses and our people who were on the stand, witness responses during a trial. And saying a word like smashed is a leading question. And I can just imagine one of those cop shows when the judge says, objection, or the other lawyer says, objection, because that's a leading question. So you don't want to ask leading questions or biased wording when you're writing survey items. Another thing that you might want to do, and I think this is a great idea, is consider reverse scoring for scale scores. Let me give you an example. I found this questionnaire, and I'll read it to you. Don't worry, I know the letters are a little bit small, about asking parents how their kindergartner was feeling on the first day of school when they were going to kindergarten or the kindergarten. The school wanted to make children very comfortable on the first day of school, but first they needed to know how were they feeling. So the survey reads, it was for the mother. It says, for each word in the following list, please tick what is the nearest to the ways you think your child was feeling on the morning of the first day at the new school. And the answer choices from left to right are very, quite, not very, not at all. And the questions are happy, worried, excited, bored, stressed, pleased, relaxed, uneasy, enthusiastic, afraid, okay, et cetera, et cetera. So they're asking emotions, and they want to know if the child feels very, quite, not very, or not at all for each of those 10 questions. Now, when you get your data and you're playing with it and you want to do statistics and frequencies and all that stuff, it's so much easier to manipulate that data if you have one score which represents the child's mood. So typically what researchers do with scale scores is they add or sum the answers to all of the items to get one number that represents that construct. It does a couple of things. It gives you more variability in your variable, which we've already talked about is good. And it also lets you describe things a lot better. You can just use one number to represent the child's mood. But think about it, okay? Let's say I've got these questions here, and I assign numbers. Very is 4, quite is 3, not very is 2, and not at all is 1. So I assign numbers to how much of the feeling the child had for each emotion, and then I add them up. Happy, worried, excited, bored. Wait a minute. If I had happy and worried, they could cancel each other out, right? If they're very happy and very worried, that's a 4 and a 4, and it shouldn't be that way. If they're very happy and very worried, their mood isn't better or worse. Happy and worried are different emotions, that they are different directions. Happy's positive and worry's negative, and if I add them together, it doesn't make more happy or more worried, right? Very confusing. So one way you can do that is what is called reverse scoring. So let's say I want, and you have to sit and think about this for a minute, but it's not rocket science. I want higher scores to mean negative emotions. I want the higher scores to mean that the kids were more stressed out about going to school. So what I would do is I would look at my questions, and all of the ones that were positive, I've got happy, excited, pleased, relaxed, and uneasy, I would reverse. So on those positive or reversed items, very is 1, quite is 2, not very is 3, and not at all is not very much. So on those reversed ones, on those positive emotions, worded 1 to 4, higher means less of a positive emotion. And on those negative emotions, which I have in pink, higher scores mean the child was more fearful. Again, so all of the questions represent the same direction. So that's reverse scoring, and it just gives you a more consistent way of measuring something. It's more stable if you've got a lot of questions, and it's all in the same direction. So that number probably actually means something instead of things canceling each other out. All right, let's take a quick break, and I'll see you back in a little bit.